it's easy to write down. Dana@methownet.com. If you want any of these info sheets. And I didn't see Olga here. I don't know if you're here,
Clicked
Olga.
on it, but it didn't take. How do I get it to do the audio?
Somebody's not muted.
Well, no, it asked if I wanted audio, and I
I'm
clicked.
scrambling here, muting. Okay, I'm gonna mute myself, Dana. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to warn Olga that there's 2 pictures of snakes.
Shift
She really
command.
freaks out when she actually really freaks out when she sees even pictures. I mean, you know, it's a mental image we carry in our brain, but most of us don't jump as high as Olga jumps. Number 21 and 22, slides 21 and 22. I guess that's the main thing. So I'll move towards making this program work. I think we want probably, not quite sure.
Let's see, you should be able to.
No, it's okay.
Not muted. Who are they?
I have January 31st at 9:45 check-in time.
Great. That'd be great.
Oh, look
Okay,
at that.
who's not muted? I can't find them. Bonnie, you're not muted. There we go. Now she is.
So the
All right.
wrong thing came up here. I'm gonna have to work on this just briefly.
Okay.
How do I back out of this?
Oh,
That's
really
a
good question.
That's a video, a short video. Those are Western toads all piled up on top of one another, and it's really quite fascinating. And I'm hoping to show it, but not at this moment. Maybe I should show it at this moment and get rid of it. I don't know. New share. How about new share? We want this, and then we want this, and then
There we go.
I have too many pictures showing here.
I just see one, Dana.
I see 6.
Oh, no, this one is just the 2 toads, Western toads.
There, I'm shrinking it down. Yeah, I've never gotten particularly good at. Okay, so it's set up. Okay. Well, thanks everybody for joining. And we talked last week about the flora of the Methow. And this time around, we're talking about the wildlife of the Methow. And what in a way is most interesting to me is it's a snapshot, really, of the evolution of life on Earth. And as we'll see here, I have some lists of how many species of these different members of the animal kingdom there are on the planet, and how many there are in the Methow. They're represented here. And I had that thought some years ago that maybe I could make something that I could handle would be thinking about evolution as it's represented in the Methow. So that's something everyone can do where you live, because most of the members of the evolutionary journey exist within 20 miles of your home. So these are Western toads, and they were always Bufo boreas, but it's good to look things up nowadays. And now they're Anaxyrus boreas. Their genus name has changed. That's neither here nor there really for us, but it's interesting to know, and that comes from probably DNA analysis and finding out their actually evolutionary affinities are a little different than people thought. So I took some of the pictures in this program, and others I did not take. This one I did take at Boiling Lake. Those of you who live in the Methow know where Boiling Lake is, up in the Sawtooth Range. It's actually a half a mile out of the Methow over Horsehead Pass, but it's close enough. And these frogs were acting out. We happened to be there at the right time. It was about June 21st, June 22nd. And there was a mating party going on. And I actually took a short little video I'll try to show later on. But so it was a fascinating show. There were about 100 frogs, toads, and they were all trying to mate. The males were like not, so they're in amplexus here. The male is behind, he's on clasping the female from behind and fertilizing her eggs as they come out of her. So it's external fertilization, but the males were like running into one another, trying to knock the other males off the females. I don't know if that sounds familiar, but you know, that's the evolutionary dynamics of much of the animal kingdom, and it's very competitive. So a relevant point here is that from what I read, I've never counted a western toad female can lay up to 17,000 eggs at a time. You know,
I've got a class starting pretty.
And the appropriate evolutionary question is, how many of those eggs has to survive to adulthood to reproduce to replace the adults? And the answer is always 2. So out of 17,000 eggs, only 2 have to survive. So natural selection is a harsh master, and most offspring in most organisms do not survive to adulthood. And that has changed a bit with mammals, and that's part of the evolutionary story. See if I can move forward here. See. It's a bit of a digression. I showed the first 2 pictures of diatoms last week. I wanted to just reiterate, these are protists. So that's one of the kingdoms of life, and we're going to go back through that in the next 2 slides. You know, it's pretty basic material, but it's interesting to be oriented to where wildlife fits into the larger scheme of things. I showed those first 2 pictures of diatoms. I didn't show the Coke bottle diatom nor Synedra down below, but I thought I would show you that. I took this picture through my microscope a year or 2 ago, and it's probably Synedra, and I put an arrow in pointing to the Coke bottle diatom. Just that someone told me about 10 years ago, Tim Hall, if any of you know who Tim Hall is, I forget if he's a aquatic biologist or what Tim Hall does, but he said, you know, if you were to look at the slime on the rocks in the Methow, it would be full of diatoms. And I hadn't done that. And now that I have, he's totally right. There are at least a dozen species of diatoms in the slime that covers the rocks in the Methow. And so diatoms are major players. Diatoms they're in the kingdom of Protists, Protoctista. They are a form of algae that make silica shells. Those beautiful shells made out of glass, but they're photosynthetic organisms. So they release oxygen into the atmosphere, and the word is that diatoms produce 25% of all the oxygen in the atmosphere. So these are major players that we don't think that much about. So here's the evolutionary journey. This is there's a fish on the left coming out of the water, turning into an amphibian. What is it? What's on its mind? Eat, survive, reproduce, turns into a reptile, turns into a mammal. Now, this is roughly true, really, if you trace the activities of these animals. But there is one other creature that has appeared, and that's Homo sapiens, who wonders what it's all about. Well, that's a rough question, and fortunately, we don't have to answer that. But I want to point out that the discipline of big history, which I mentioned previously, which is really just the evolutionary story, but it's the evolutionary story with some connectivity. The evolution is not random. It's not necessarily, it's not a straight line by any stretch of the imagination, and we'll see that in a moment. But there are some themes that emerge, and a couple that big history has identified. One is increasing complexity over time. That's interesting. That it might be arguable, but I think anybody arguing against would lose the argument, because in the early universe, the word we get from the scientific community is that all that existed was hydrogen and a little bit of helium. Hydrogen is the simplest element, 1 proton and 1 electron. Somehow it managed to exist in the early universe. Helium, 2 electrons, 2 protons. None of the other elements existed. Now there's 92 naturally occurring elements. Where did they come from? Well, that's the big history story. There was no life, there were no planets, there were no stars. And that all has emerged over time. And that is the complexification, and it's not over. So what's it all about? We don't have to answer that, but there is something going on. And a second theme in big history is emergence. There's always something new. There were no fish. There were no amphibians. There was no life on land. There were no mammals. All this has emerged. So it's a good story. And it's a true story as far as we know. It's the best story we know. We talked about this last week. I don't think I showed this slide. It's just reiteration, but I think it's interesting to be oriented that right now the biologists divide life up into 3 domains and 6 kingdoms or 7 kingdoms. And that's variable. You can get it's not totally agreed upon. But so these domains, one of the domains is bacteria. It says bacteria, means true bacteria. And then they realized that there were these other bacterial-like cells, which are prokaryotes. They're very simple cells. They're 1/100th the size of our cells, which are eukaryotic cells. Bacterial cells, archaeal cells are very small, but they do work. And they're the first to appear on the planet. That we have no real idea how life appeared. Anyhow, 3 domains: bacteria, archaea, and the eukaryotes. Well, I was counting up the kingdoms here. I said there were 6 kingdoms last week. And if you count these up, you get 7. And up on top, it says chromis. Well, I'll tell you, Google is great for figuring things out. So arguably, there's another kingdom, chromis, of a particular kind of photosynthetic organism. It's not really important whether there's 6, 7, or 8 kingdoms. And you can find 8, you can find more than that. But life has diversified, and the route to diversification can be identified. We looked at this last week, and I think I circled a few things. So prokaryotes, simple kinds of cells, bacteria and archaea up top. I can't quite see it, blocked out on my screen. Eukaryotes, they're much larger cells, more complex, but it's not as if bacterial cells are simple. You could not build one. And I circled these because this is one kingdom, the protists. Algae are protists, and chromis aren't on here. But some of these are, I've had this particular picture for 10 years. It might be out of date. Anyhow, animals, fungi, plants, protists, bacteria, and archaea. So down at the bottom, it says last universal common ancestor, Luca. All the evidence is the life appeared one time on planet Earth, and everything has diversified from that, including our topic of today, the animal kingdom. Here's a more complex view of the tree of life. This is the same structure, but far more complicated. And I put a start here in the middle there. That's where the first life appeared. It says below start here, it says the birth of the Earth. And then at about 3.5 billion years, the little branching structure appears. That's the appearance of life is about 3.6 billion years ago. The first organisms over there on the left were bacteria and archaea. The eukaryotes appeared and have diversified grandly since then. I circled mammals over here on the far right. But that's how complicated the tree of life actually is, as opposed to that previous picture. Well, most of these organisms are present where you live. I mean, I see sharks up there. There's no sharks in the Methow, but yeah. So here I just circled mass extinctions, and I think probably everybody has some awareness of this, but there have been a number of mass extinction events. Life is not a given. Maybe we should really, what do they say? Not grab the day, but seize the day, seize the day. What is that? There's a big asteroid that's supposed to pass in a couple of days. I mean, it's going to be 1 million miles away, but if it hit the Earth, it'd be another mass extinction event. There have been 5 mass extinction events, major mass extinction events, and many lesser mass extinction events. And some evolutionary lines. So I'm going to see if I can find here's my cursor. See, these lines fade out here. There's white spots in here. These are evolutionary lines that just died out. There are no guarantees. There are no guarantees. Life is insecure. And it's tenuous, but it has persisted for 3.5 billion years. How has it diversified? How is this, going back for a moment, how has this diversification come about? Certainly in part through natural selection. And what is natural selection? Well, especially by means of sexual reproduction, the genetic code in offspring varies from the adults, the parents. A little, usually just a little. It varies a little. But so that Western toad lays 17,000 eggs. Well, a little bit of variation in 17,000 offspring is a lot of variation. The idea would be the Earth actually, the idea is that the Earth changes all the time. The Earth is not static, and life has to adapt to the changing Earth. I think every time that comes up, it's news to us because every little change blows us away and we just fret about the changes. But the nature of the planet is dynamic, is to change. Life is adapting. So some of those offspring, some few of those offspring are going to be the best adapted and are the most likely to survive. So this is an example from the annals of biology of this moth that lives in England. And it was white. It was a white moth. There were almost no dark morphs, dark forms. But in the early 1800s, there was so much the atmosphere because of burning coal in England that the barks of trees turned dark. And then in the lower picture, see the dark moth is now camouflaged and the white moth is very clear. And in fact, there is a white moth in the upper picture and it's so invisible, I put an arrow to it, sorry. That's the body of a white moth where I put that red arrow and the wings are there, but you can't see them. It's perfectly camouflaged. Why is that? Because life is dangerous. Everything eats everything else. And all animals are trying to survive. However many offspring there are, they're all trying to survive. Those that are best adapted. Well, those white ones were best adapted when the bark turned dark. The dark moths were best adapted, and the dark moths became the dominant morph in the 1800s. It was a living example of natural selection. They took the soot out of the atmosphere, less coal and scrubbers, and the bark lightened up, and now there's fewer dark morph pepper moths. Just a cool example of natural selection in action. There are other good examples. These are not animals, these are protists, but I thought they should at least get an honorable mention. For one thing, they are so exquisite, so magnificent, and we don't know anything or much about them. And I had these in a file, but I couldn't remember what they were. I had to look up coccolithophores, radiolarians, and I've looked at, but I've almost never seen them. But they exist. They exist in a big way. So these are aquatic organisms that live in the ocean, mostly. Some of these, there are protists, certainly protists, and protists with shells. These have shells that live in fresh water, but these are primarily sea organisms. But they're major players in ways that I had no idea. These are single-celled organisms in that kingdom of protists. They build shells out of different structures. The coccolithophores build their shells out of calcium carbonate. That is one of the concerns about ocean acidification, is that it makes it harder for the chemistry to occur for these shells to be built. But that is another story. So the second one is this coccolith called Emiliana huxleyi. Well, if you look up Emiliana huxleyi, it dominates the ocean. Emiliana, it's 75% of the protists at times of the photosynthetic. These are photosynthetic organisms. 75% of the biomass of protists at times are this coccolith that we never heard of, Emiliana huxleyi, which means it's photosynthetic. It means it could be producing 10% of the oxygen in the atmosphere, this one species of protist. And there are others. In their picture below, there's a group called radiolarians, which actually make their shells out of silica, foraminifera. I think also silica, I forget for sure. It's just this beautiful hidden world. Sometimes I wonder if we need to travel as far as we do when we go on vacation, when the world around us is totally full of wonder, if we could just slow down enough to become aware of it. So all of this humanity, to humanity's great credit, has not only had to learn, but has learned. Humanity had no idea about any of these organisms or the smaller creatures, even in the animal kingdom, through most of our long, several 100,000-year history. Well, this Anton Lewinok down there on the bottom, this I forget, Danish or Dutch man in the late 1600s started making magnifying lenses and finding that the water was full of these little creatures he called animalcules. And soon after that, Nicholas Hartsoker looked at human sperm, and he was able to see that inside the head of a sperm are tiny preformed human beings. I don't know if you knew that. And this held sway for quite a while, and it was thought, therefore, that the vital force of life was contained in the male, and the female of the species, known as women, just carried that in their bodies. But the men created it. Well, that's the typical male chauvinist pigs, and it's not true. Of course, it's not true. It just has one copy of the DNA of the species in the sperm. It has to combine with the DNA in the egg to form a living organism, an ovum. But here's a funny picture of these homunculus, little people that are carried in sperm. The point really is, anything we do know about the Earth, we had to struggle to learn and put up with innumerable misperceptions. Mark Twain says, it ain't what you know what gets you in trouble, it's what you know that ain't so. And we still know a lot that ain't so. Sorry, I had to put my clock up here. So the animal kingdom, there were no animals. There was no life on land. There were no animals. Life has diversified. Now there are several million animals. This is probably out of E.O. Wilson's book, The Diversity of Life, which I have down here. But that book's 20 years old, and these numbers are out of date. I especially can tell that. So down there, lower left, Coleoptera, the beetles. Well, now there's 1 million beetles have been identified. 1 million beetles have been identified. And that's the way it goes. You know, humanity's trying to understand the world that we live in. But this gives you a sense of the diversity of the animal kingdom, which is what we're talking about today. I'm talking about animal kingdom in the Methow. So I circled here the vertebrates. So mammals. What did I capture here? It's a little out of line, but I got a bit of the arthropods. Anyhow, the point would be that, so chordates are animals with backbones. Well, what are those animals? Fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. Mammals are a rather small slice of that, but that shows how many. There's about 4,000 mammals on the planet, and some number in the Methow, and we're going to talk about that. I put in a few numbers here because my point would be, any place you live is an evolutionary workshop for the journey of life. So you can find these organisms wherever you are. Right now we know of 107, so Lepidoptera are butterflies and moths. We know of 107 butterfly species in the Methow Valley. How many moths? I would say nobody has any idea. Many more, probably 1,000 species of moths. You know, they're harder to identify and nobody's done that work. Other organisms, that's 52 grasshopper species. Who would think? Who would think there were 52 grasshoppers in the Methow Valley? Well, apparently there are. Hymenoptera, so 172 bees. John Colts, you can unmute yourself if you know of more bumblebees. There are about 13. So John Colts, I saw that he's here today, and he's really our local expert on bumblebees, and he has studied them intensively, and he can actually identify them. And so, as you'll see, I've made a guide. John has a better guide. But these other organisms, this is the diversification of the animal kingdom on the planet. So you can study these, and people do study butterflies, and the best way to study butterflies is to get them to land on your head, like this little girl has a Mylitta crescent on her head. It's a little easier to see them if you can get them on your nose. So this is a morning cloak. And by the way, I just goofed around a little bit, you know. I think there's some real science here as we talk about the diversification of life and that tree of life, which is so complicated. But there are these fun ways to interact with the natural world. And one is this way of intensely studying butterflies. So this is a morning cloak. And here is Lorcan's Admiral, and here is a two-tailed tiger swallowtail. Some of you know what this is about. This is because of Robert Michael Pyle, you know, the West's great butterfly guy. And I don't know if he developed it, but you catch a butterfly in a net, you can take it out, hold it in your hand and identify it. It's a little stunned by its experience, and you put it on somebody's nose just because it's fun. That's why. And the butterfly sometimes will start eating the salt on the person's nose. So these other creatures do exist, and we don't know much about them, but look how beautiful they are. The upper picture shows this bumblebee, and we talked about that last week, that bumblebee is they're really the pollination specialists on the planet. They know how to pollinate flowers that cannot be pollinated by other organisms. And that bumblebee is pushing the wing petals out of the way on that one lupin flower, and the keel, which is a petal, is showing up, and it'll push on that keel, and the reproductive structures will shoot out. I mean, just stick up and hit that bee in the belly. They just know what they're doing. But look at these other bees, Agapostemon. We have these metallic bees that are so gorgeous. I mean, if I see them, it's usually that they died in a bucket of water out in the garden. And these longhorn bees, they pollinate our squash. First I read it, and then I started looking, and sure enough, if you look at the bees in those big flowers on our squash, often they're these longhorn bees. So the point is only the diversity that exists around us that is so beautiful when we come to see it. These are guides that I could email you. This bumblebee guide. So bumblebees are barcoded. You know, that's a small joke, but they almost are barcoded in the coloration of their thorax and abdomen, and even their head is important. The hairs on their head. You can come pretty darn close to identifying a bumblebee by observing the colors of the head, thorax, and abdomen. And you can harass John Colts if you want a better key, but you could get one from me. And then this thing on the right was a guide to common bee genera, I think of the Methow, and I put this in the Naturalist about 10 years ago. But it's got value because we don't know these genera exist. And so this guide points out that they do, and that they can be identified, at least to genus, if not to species. To species is pretty tricky. That's for the, I don't know, Hymenopterus. So this is, let's see, I have a few things underlined in red here. Oh, I don't know where that red line came from, but here's two red lines on the upper left. Number of species in the world, number of species in the Methow. So this is the vertebrate portion of the animal kingdom, and it's the animals that we see. How many fish are there in the world? How many amphibians, reptiles, and how many are represented in the Methow? Part of the point is that most of the organisms that exist on the planet have a representative in the Methow or wherever you live, and can be enjoyed, observed, and learned about. So this also I put together a number of years ago, and I especially felt compelled. I'm going to change, let's see. Well, there's another, what comes up? Oh yeah, I changed the birds. It says 265. I just changed it to 285 because in the last 15 years, we found another 20 species of birds. You know what it takes to find birds is a birder, somebody who knows how to identify birds, can identify their songs, has binoculars. Because birds have wings, unusual species will show up more often than unusual reptiles show up in the Methow. We haven't gotten any new reptiles since I put this together, but we did get a new mammal. I'm going to change 72 to 73 because a new mammal was found a year or two ago in the Methow. Well, it's not easy to find a new mammal. That was a chipmunk, actually. So one thing that red line is a mistake. I think I did, well, one thing to see here is something's going on. Those X's create a pattern of increasing what? Arguably increasing complexity. This is an evolutionary journey from fish through reptiles to mammals. Life has arguably complexified. At least it's changed. We could say that. And I think I underlined a few things. Look at the heart change from a 2-chambered heart in fish. And I do have a picture of that coming up to a 4-chambered heart in mammals. Why? because the atmosphere is filling up with oxygen. Do you remember what oxygen does? Also warm-blooded. Warm-blooded means more energy. Warm-blooded organisms, fish are not warm-blooded, amphibians are not warm-blooded, mostly reptiles are not, birds and mammals are. That means you can be far more active. You can probably be 100 times as active, but you need 10 times more food that goes with the activity. So it's just almost arguably more life in the warm-blooded organisms. And parental care, I just underlined parental care. Look, that appeared. There's no parental care in fish, almost no parental care. We can remember pictures of some fish takes its offspring into its mouth to protect them, but that's rare. Most of these organisms lay their eggs and leave. They never see their offspring. If they see a small one, they might eat it. They wouldn't know it was their offspring. Parental care appeared in birds. We know that, in nests, and is quite intense in mammals, as any mother can affirm. But less offspring. Very few people have 17,000 offspring like the Western toad, or the worst case scenario. Remember the sunfish? I think it's called a moa. That's a very large, very flat fish. It lays 3 million eggs in one spawning season. That might be over a period of a month. 3 million eggs. How many of those 3 million eggs have to survive to replace the parents? 2. The answer to that question is always 2. Oh my gosh, look at that red line. It's going to persist. Maybe it'll get blocked out with the next slide. So I showed this last week. I actually like this diagram a lot. This is the weight of the animal of the kingdoms of life. Here are 6 kingdoms, no chromis, which we briefly talked about. Viruses are there, which are, it's argued, are viruses alive? Are they not alive? They don't weigh very much, but there are a lot of them. They're so tiny that they didn't rate very high in weight, but there are plenty of viruses. It's said we have almost 400 million virus particles in our bodies. They're part of our lives. But plants dominate. Plants dominate. Animals are a bit of a hangnail because animals can't make their own food. Animals have to eat, have to acquire energy from photosynthetic organisms, mostly plants or animals that have eaten plants. So there are far fewer animals than plants. I put in this next slide is my only commentary on the environmental issues on our planet. That red line is still there. This is one of the most powerful graphics I've seen in terms of expressing the issues that we face on the planet. And that is that of the weight of mammals on the planet, 60% are now livestock, 30% are humans, and 4% are wild mammals. So humans have basically commandeered all of the energy on the planet. I have this little thing up here. It's called overshoot. It's an ecological term. There's a stupendous book by that title, Overshoot. That subtitle is The Ecological Basis of Revolutionary Change. Just a great book. But the point here is that it's arguable to some, it's not arguable to a biologist or an ecologist. The human species is in a state of overshoot. We're about to hit 8 billion, but we are reducing the productivity of the planet enormously. And you know that. And so I'm not going to dwell on it, and we don't need more bad news, but we do need to be aware of what's going on. So that's the only environmental slide. At one point, pretty soon here, I'll see if I can get rid of that red line. So we're talking about wildlife in the Methow. These are the fish species in the Methow. The ones with X's are alien species. They are here. They're species that are here. But it's the invasion of the aliens. Some of these are from Europe. Some of these fish are from Europe. And the rest are from the East Coast of the United States. Mostly they've been introduced purposely by people who like to fish, but they do interfere with the natural and healthy functioning of local ecosystems. So we have, in the upper picture, there's a lamprey. And there are lamprey in the Methow River, and lamprey are anadromous. They, as juveniles, they go to the ocean. They live for, I forget how many years, not too many, 1 or 2 or 3 in the ocean, and they have to swim back up 500 miles over 7 dams, 9 dams, I forget how many dams between us and the ocean. And they are almost extinct in the Methow Valley, in the Methow watershed. It's just asking too much. Well, you might think you might not want a parasitic vertebrate in your ecosystem, but they serve a function, a valuable function. There's a lot more of their offspring in the offspring are filter feeders and live in the organic matter that gathers in the pools in the waterways, in the Methow River, in all our rivers, in other rivers where these organisms exist. And they break down the organic matter in those pools. So they serve a vital function. And then the adults are served as food, the larger organisms. They're not really damaging to ecosystems, but they're also almost gone. Chinook salmon. So the only of those 3 pictures that I took is the middle one. I got in with a wetsuit. And this fish, this is a female Chinook who has laid her eggs and buried them in a red, that's what they call the nest. And they're so exhausted that I was able to get close enough to take a picture. And of course, they're programmed to die. So the interesting thing about that is, I forget I think we leave fish. So I want to mention here, life has mysteriously developed the means of enriching the capacity for the earth to support life over time. We started with no species. Luca, the first species, there was no life on land. You couldn't really have plants. There was no organic matter in the soil. And now plants dominate. You know, one of the great tricks is this group of fish, salmon, that are anadromous and go to the ocean to grow up. And then they swim back to their natal streams where they were born, and they carry pounds and pounds of rich ocean nutrients back to the mountains, I mentioned last week, they swim 2,000 miles up the Yukon, 550 miles to get to winter up the Columbia and the Methow. And there were salmon that weighed over 100 pounds formerly coming up the Columbia. Used to be, I have it written down, let's see, I think 16 to 20 million salmon used to come up the Columbia annually to all of the rivers, not just the Methow, maybe 50,000 to the Methow. And now it's 600,000, 1/20th. So, you know, humanity is impacting the vitality of these ecosystems, but we're trying to learn, and we're getting a little better at it, arguably. So it supported this fish coming back. I put that bear in there because the bottom picture, because these fish brought all of these nutrients back from the ocean and supported the whole ecosystem. You can find the nutrients from salmon in cottonwood trees. So we have this evolutionary story. Fish evolved before amphibians, but at some point, amphibians came out of the water. I mean, fish came out of the water. This is a fish that comes out of the water and can breathe oxygen through its mouth. The mud skipper, why does it come out of the water? It comes out of the water to breed because it's safer. When it first started coming out, probably 100,000 years ago, there were no predators on land. There was nothing on land. That started the process. So you can see the evolution of organisms, both in the fossil record and in organisms that exist today. So there's this saying, I wrote it out down below, ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. That means that the development of the individual recapitulates the evolutionary journey. This is an old drawing that illustrates that. It's a little bit controversial, but in sum, it's accurate. And what it shows, and I circled a few things here, that's the first week of these various organisms. So the first little creature up there is what a fish looks like after the ovum has been fertilized and the fish starts to develop. Looks something like a fish, actually. But the next one is a salamander, a tortoise, a chick. They all look the same because ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. The evolutionary organisms recapitulate the evolutionary journey in the development of their body. They diverge as time goes on. There's the second week, the third week there, they no longer look the same. But over here on the right is a human at 1 week in utero, and it looks like a fish. In fact, it has gills and it has a tail. It's just more evidence of the evolutionary journey. These are the amphibians of the Methow. So we briefly looked at fish, briefly looking at amphibians. The last 5, so I put this list together. To tell you the truth, it was at least 20 years ago. And I thought we might find those last 5, and we never have in the Methow. I mean, so that newt, remember that rough skin newt number 12 that has that orange belly because it's somewhat toxic. And so that's aposematic coloring. It warns predators that it's poisonous. It shows its orange belly. It exists in Chilean, but it doesn't exist here. But tailed frogs do exist. Tailed frogs are considered one of the most ancient of amphibians on the planet. Its closest relative is in New Zealand. Figure out the plate tectonics there, how that could be possible. But we have tailed frogs. They're not uncommon. I wouldn't call them common, but they're not uncommon in the Methow, in mountain streams. They're in Cutthroat Creek, for example, and such. And Western toads, we've talked about this in another picture. So I am going to try something here. I'm going to take that out. Now I can get rid of this red line. I don't know where that came from. I hope I can get rid of it. Boy, that red line is insistent. It won't select. I don't know what the deal is with that. We're going to have to live with that. I'm going to try to show. So these toads, this is at Boiling Lake last June, and they were mating, and there was, I guess the next slide indicates that there was a toad rave going on. I'm going to see if I can show that to you. This is I took this with my camera. Oh, look at that. The on button is hidden. What if I hit that? No. Oh, how about this and this? It's trying. Oh, it went out. Didn't like my toad rave. I'm going to try again here. Give me 10 seconds. I'm going to amphibians. I'm going to Bufo-Boreas toad rave. There they are. A toad rave. So this is what they were doing. This is what they were doing when they weren't mating. This is after mating. If someone could please, I'm sorry about that red line. I can't get rid of it. If somebody could please explain to me what these toads are doing, I would appreciate it.
I'm not seeing it.
Oh, you're not seeing
No,
it.
I just see toad rave. Looks like you're.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, I guess that was somewhat experimental and didn't work. So I hope I can get back to this. Did that come up?
Let's
Can you see that?
It just, there we go. It's a rattlesnake, it looks like.
The gopher snake, yeah.
Gopher snake, okay.
Well, that's curious to me. I'll have to experiment with that. That was a short video. These
Oh,
frogs, these toads had piled up on top of one another in the water, and there was this wrestling match going on, rolling over in the water, and I could see it. So I don't know why you couldn't, but it's a matter of learning, getting a little better at Zoom. So, but our point here is we're on an evolutionary journey. We're moving from amphibians to reptiles. Amphibians, you know, that word means 2 lives. Amphibians often live part of their life on land and part of their life in water. They're like that cartoon I showed of amphibians coming out of the water, leaving fish. Reptiles, most reptiles don't need water. And they live on land. How do they live on land? Well, for one thing, they're covered with scales, which maintains the internal moisture they have to maintain. And they have a hard-shelled egg, unlike the leathery egg of amphibians or gelatinous egg. They have a shelled egg that retains the moisture in the shell, so the eggs can be laid on land. So reptiles could colonize land. It's an evolutionary journey. And these are a few reptiles, I think. Well, these are reptiles here at my place. There is a garter snake den on my property. They come out every year on about April 1st. They lie around warming up because they are cold-blooded. The sun's out in early April on the rocks, and they're warming up their bodies so they can perform metabolism, chemical functions in their body, and then they all disperse. They come back in the fall and go back into this underground lair, but pretty cute. This is a gopher snake. I was out checking bird boxes, and up on the top of that pine tree, there is, not on the top, but it was 15 feet up. I had a ladder with me. This gopher snake was going up to that bird box, climbing in the bark of the ponderosa. And this is a rattlesnake den that somebody told me about, and I was able to find it at Pipestone. And they do the same thing. They hibernate underground in the winter. They can't freeze. They come out and then they lie in the sun for about 2 weeks and have to warm up their bodies to get their chemical processes going before dispersing. So, and then a list of what reptiles we have over there on the left. Reptiles evolved into birds. Birds are considered to be dinosaurs, one branch of dinosaurs. Birds have scales, birds lay eggs, birds have various similarities with reptiles. This is a Archaeopteryx. It's a fossil. Interestingly enough, it was found in 1861 in Germany. Darwin's book on the origin of species was printed in 1859, and it created quite an uproar because it suggested that humans had evolved over time, and worse, we'd evolved from apes, and it was very offensive for people. As I said, probably in the first program, now we know we're related to zucchini, so get over it. But this is a cross between a reptile and a bird, and it was found in 1861, 2 years after Darwin's book was first released, and it was considered to be very powerful evidence of the evolutionary process. It's basically a reptile with feathers. Archaeopteryx, a bird that could fly. So here are some birds. I took these pictures, but I put up this bird box at Sullivan's Pond for goldeneyes, because goldeneyes are cavity nesters, and I got western screech owls. And when I walked up to the box, the young ones stuck their heads out, and I got to this wonderful view. And now that box is burned up in that Twisp River fire. So that's kind of an example of the dynamics of the earth, that just things are always changing. So I have here at home, there is this strange phenomenon in the Methow and probably in the West that Canada geese nest in tubs up in trees. And even the Department of Fish and Wildlife, especially in earlier years, has put tubs up 15 feet, 20 feet up in trees for Canada geese, and they nest in them. And the first year I put this up, I got a great horned owl, and that's what that is, a great horned owl. And after the great horned owl sat there for probably 25 days, these appeared. They look like stuffed animals, but these are the offspring. So this is just something fun, so some delight in interacting with the animal kingdom in the Methow. And similarly with bluebirds, we have mountain bluebirds and western bluebirds in the Methow among our 285 species of birds. They're migratory, of course. They're not here now, although some western bluebirds were seen last month in Winthrop. I don't know what they were doing here. But I have bluebird trail up. That means a series of boxes, and it's best if you check them in, say, late May. They start nesting in early May, and you might find problems. I don't do that too much now. It's hard to find the time, but some years ago, I was checking them, and there was a male with a grasshopper in his mouth trying to get into the box, and the swallows were driving it away. It tried a number of times. It landed on the box. It could have gone in, but it was afraid of the swallows and flew away. My interpretation is the female had been killed, and so it was no longer had the strength of a mated pair, and the swallows were able to intimidate it. Typically, bluebirds can dominate swallows. I opened that box, and there were 4 starving baby bluebirds in there. And I brought them home and raised them, and 2 of them lived, and here they are. And I tried to teach them to push this wheelbarrow, do some work, some useful work, but they were much better at using the computer. And so I just let them do some of my data entry. And that's, of course, I'm just goofing around. But my most pleasant, my most deepest feelings of enjoyment are when I've been able to interact with wildlife in this way. And I didn't steal them, they were dying. I saved their lives. So we talked about speciation, we talked about diversification of life, and Goldeneyes are such a good example of this speciation of one species becoming two, because they look so much alike. We have these two species of Goldeneyes, but they're in the same genus, which indicates the same ancestor, but they rarely crossbreed, they rarely hybridize. They're two distinct species. We have one species here in the winter, common, and one species in the summer, barrows. So in part, they've split the genetic code apart by habitat, by time. And what could have caused that? Most likely the last ice age. There was a mile of ice in the Methow and all through northern Washington and completely covering British Columbia, probably divided one species into two. They had 10,000 years to drift genetically, because every generation is different than the previous generation because of natural selection, and they drifted apart into two species. Here's another worksheet I put together trying to correlate. So we have this biological history. We talked about geology in the first program. How do they correlate? It kind of got cut off here at the bottom, but it said mammals first appeared 200 million years ago. Well, that's when the twist formation was being laid down. The Methow Ocean existed and the twist formation was being laid down. So that's what's over here in the geology column. And I'm just trying to correlate, trying to make sense of what appeared when. Here's the first flowering plants by this errant red line. 120 million years ago, it says that's approximately when the Methow Graben, the valley, started to sink and create the valley. Pipestone sediments here, it says 58, I'd say 60 million years ago. This was interesting here. So this is in biology, there are, and I think we mentioned this, but there's Dawn redwood fossils in pipestone. Well, they are semi-tropical plants, and pipestone is thought to have been laid down in place. Some sediments may have come from elsewhere, but that means if pipestone is laid down in place and they have semi-tropical plants, we had a semi-tropical environment in the Methow 60 million years ago, which later became the Pleistocene Ice Age. That's how much things change over time. Speaking of which, 954. So this oxygenation of the atmosphere, we talked about this. If you ask most people why do we breathe? They say for oxygen. What's the oxygen do? Typically, we don't know, but we did talk about it. So photosynthesis puts these hydrocarbons together, stores energy in the chemical bond, the energy of the sun. Oxygen pulls it apart and releases that energy, and we call it food. We call it digestion. Just a reminder of this process of carbon dioxide and water being energized by solar energy and trapping that energy, all these little. So the oxygen's in the atmosphere. I like this idea of an Earth battery. It really is a battery, far from equilibrium. The Earth's surface is far from equilibrium. Oxygen wants to react with these hydrocarbons, but it can't necessarily get at them until it can get over the inertial block, like with wood. Wood would, at 30%, I think the next slide shows that oxygen has gone to, it's 21% right now. It has gone to 30% at one time, briefly, on Earth. You could not put a fire out at 30% of oxygen. So the most interesting thing to me, this stuff I put in the side, that graduating MIT guy up on top, and I encourage you to Google photosynthesis at MIT and watch that 3-minute video. They have no idea how photosynthesis works. They just graduated from Harvard and MIT. So you can't talk about Earth processes without understanding something about photosynthesis. This is oxygen in the atmosphere over time. There's a time scale on the bottom, starting on the lower left. 4.5 billion years ago, that's when the Earth formed. There was no oxygen. Oxygen is very reactive. It wants to react with other elements and form compounds. So the only reason there's any oxygen in the atmosphere, and I put a red line in, is 21% oxygen, is because photosynthetic organisms are constantly pumping oxygen into the atmosphere. It actually goes down a little bit in the northern hemisphere in the winter because plants are not photosynthesizing in the cold climes in the northern hemisphere. So I circled the first oxygen producing organisms upper left were bacteria, cyanobacteria. Land plants appeared fairly recently, 400,000 years ago. And they would have increased the photosynthetic capacity of the earth. And then there's that spike. I didn't circle it, but this big spike here up to 30%. I don't think it's not totally known why that happened. And it's a little complicated. It's partly because the decomposers didn't know how to decompose wood. And so what happened to the wood? It became coal. That's why we have, this is the Carboniferous period, actually. So the carbon dioxide was being sequestered in coal. Well, it has the oxygen, it couldn't react. It couldn't react with the hydrocarbons. And so there was more oxygen in the atmosphere. It wasn't reacting. That's the explanation. Briefly, I don't know if you get that. So our circulatory system has evolved with the increase in oxygen in the atmosphere, because more oxygen and more hydrocarbons means more energy. And that's what has occurred. So this is the circulatory system of a fish. The heart has only one ventricle, and one atrium. And the oxygenated blood is mixed with the deoxygenated blood. It's very inefficient, but it doesn't matter because they're cold-blooded. It might look like they move a lot, but they don't move a lot compared to warm-blooded organisms. Interestingly enough, reptiles, they have two atria, these upper portions of the heart, separate from one another, but the ventricle has an incomplete wall. And so the oxygenated blood and the deoxygenated blood are mixed together. And again, it's not a very efficient means of carrying oxygenated blood around the body. And that's not the case with birds and mammals. The heart has 4 distinct chambers. The 2 oxygenated and deoxygenated are kept completely separate, go to the lungs to pick up the oxygen and carry to the body. Far more efficient, you can express far more energy in your body and in your life, and you can be warm-blooded. Duck-billed platypus, this is a mammal. It's a mammal that lays eggs and has a bird bill. It's just evidence. I'm going to go a little faster here because of time, but I think there's about 40 slides, so we're not too far off. But this organism exists, and like that fossil Archaeopteryx reptile turning into a bird, it's evidence of the evolutionary process, and it is an ancient creature. It's 100 million years old. It dates back to the early appearance of mammals on the planet. Of course, they do still exist in Australia only. So mammals appear. How do mammals differ from especially reptiles and to some degree from birds? Mammals have hair. Mammals have mammary glands. They produce milk. They maintain a constant internal temperature. And interestingly enough, relatively few offspring with high parental investment. It's just a different strategy. And it's an interesting phenomenon in an evolutionary sense that one could argue that life is evolving to try and take better care of itself, something along those lines, because that's what has occurred in the evolutionary process. Fewer offspring, more parental care, better chance of survival of those few offspring. Here's a couple of the smallest mammals on the planet and the largest, a blue whale, at 150 tons. That's how much variety there is in mammals. Mammals of the Methow. I actually have the numbers. I'm going to pull them up, but you get to guess. Well, we don't have any idea. It's just a rough guess. But shrews and moles. Well, there may or may not be a mole in the Methow. A few people say there are, but I've never seen one. So I need the habeas corpus. That means show me the body. That's actually what that means. Show me the evidence. I want to see a mole. There's 4 species of shrews in the Methow. How many bats? More than you think. More than you think. 15 species of bats. Not here in the winter, only here in the summer. Rabbits and pikas. You could almost figure that out. We know there's 1 pika. Let's see. I can think of, there's snowshoe hare. There's that rabbit that's been showing up. What do we call that rabbit? It's a cottontail, mountain cottontail. I can think of 3. Rodents. Well, you'd never guess. There's a lot of rodents, 30 rodents. Okay, here's an easy one. How many monkeys and apes in the Methow? just one. It's an ape. More carnivores than you think, hoofed animals. I think that includes, I tried to count them up in my head. That includes elk. There's about one elk at a time in the Methow Valley. Anyhow, it's just getting a sense of what's here. And curiously, how rarely we think about this. You know, our lives are pretty much involved with our own species and our own society. And I don't know, I think maybe our lives would be richer if we could incorporate a larger view of life. So this is probably the smallest mammal in the Methow, the montane shrew. It has to eat, I have it written down, but I'm not going to look. It's either 1 or 2 times its own body weight every day to live, to survive. Because it's so small, it can't retain any heat. The only way to retain heat is continual metabolism. So it's constantly breaking down food. Moose, things have changed. You know, we have more moose than we used to. That's part because of the fires that have, after fires, you get willows, and moose eat willows. This is at Roger Lake. And this, I actually took this, and I was actually sitting there with my botany book identifying a flower, and this moose walked out. So I chased it around taking pictures. I took this picture too. This is a Pipestone Canyon. These are coyotes. And Annika and I were doing a plant survey, and we saw this coyote running steeply up a hill, getting away from us. And then Annika grabbed my arm and said, "Dana." I thought it was a rattlesnake. And instead it was these 8 very juvenile coyotes looking at us from a den up on the hill. And we went up to the den, and they went down in, and we could hear them. And actually one came out and sat there by a flower. I have some pictures. Anyhow, it was just a great experience. I went back the next day. I could not help myself, take more pictures, and they were gone. The mother had moved them. But awfully cute. Couldn't get any cuter than that, unless this could be cuter than that. These are red squirrels that Scott Fitkin phoned me some years ago and said, "Do you want 2 baby squirrels?" They found them on a trail at Pipestone. So we raised them, and possibly ill-advisedly took them to a river camp, and the kids had them in their pockets. These are my shoes. We're at the end, almost 2 or 3 more slides, but this is this is a page out of the Methow Naturalist. It's one of my favorite issues, along with that one I showed previously, the evolution of grass. But these are the Pleistocene mammals, the megafauna that existed in North America just 12,000 years ago. All these creatures were present 12,000 years ago, including multiple species of elephants. And by 10,000 years ago, they had all disappeared. So camels, llamas, elk, moose, giant. There was an American lion that was bigger than an African lion 12,000 years ago. It's now gone. So things change over time. This was at the end of the last ice age. You wouldn't think, I mean, there's some controversy over why they disappeared. There is now general agreement that probably the appearance of Homo sapiens is implicated in their disappearance. And some of the evidence is in these huge Clovis culture blades. These are 6-inch long blades. Here's a picture in somebody's hand. These were found in Wenatchee, East Wenatchee in 1987. They were digging a water line for an orchard, and they found this cache of, I don't know, something like 40 blades. They weren't all huge blades like this. I think these are the biggest spear points that have ever been found in North America, but they were obviously killing large animals. And there were elephants in Washington State. There are fossil remains around the state that have been found, numerous. And this is another piece of evidence. This is from E.O. Wilson's book, The Diversity of Life. It shows the extinction rate when humans appeared on different continents. So the top one is Africa. Humans evolved in Africa over a period of 200,000 years. There was not any large die-off of large mammals because they co-evolved with mammals, and mammals knew how to deal with Homo sapiens. But when mammals appeared in Australia, there was an enormous die-off. We have, 80% of the large mammals are disappearing. 80% are disappearing, as we showed previously in North America. The Madagascar, they all disappeared. And New Zealand, all the large mammals were killed. So we're still learning. So this is a cartoon that relates to this story of humans eating animals. It's a lion judge who's passing judgment on a lion defendant, a lion defendant. And the defendant says, I was hungry. And the judge says, you were hungry? Case dismissed. It is the nature of life. Everything eats everything else. Humans have more power than your average animal. And we're still learning how to live ecologically on the planet. So last slide, I pulled up my very favorite quote relating to these changes over time. Time is a river of passing events. Everything changes over time. And I've seen a lot of changes here in the Methow. Animals have disappeared, animals have appeared, population of humans has grown, but everything's temporary. And that's part of, can be part of, it tends to be worrisome to us, but it can be a source of excitement that we live on a very dynamic planet. Thank you indeed for listening. There's my email if you want any of those worksheets that I showed.